Hey everybody, Professor Rossi welcoming you all back to my page. Greetings also from Tashkent, Uzbekistan. I'm back here for another semester, the fall semester, in what may very well be my final academic year here teaching at Webster University. Most of my students are now seniors, and I'm just looking forward to them graduating in a couple of months. For those of you who follow both me and my colleague Pascal Lottaz's page, Neutrality Studies, you know that I was a guest on his page last week where we discussed, among other things, the current situation in Kursk, as well as the contemporary situation surrounding the special military operation in Ukraine. And just like before, he is gracious enough to allow me to reproduce the entire talk on my page, so all credit is given to Pascal's page, Neutrality Studies. If you haven't checked his page out, please do so. He produces amazing content, and it's always a pleasure whenever he and I speak together. I'm looking forward to at least two more podcasts with him while I'm here in Tashkent. So without further ado, I offer you on my own page the interview that he had given me about a week ago on his page, Neutrality Studies. I mean, as far as the Ukrainian side is concerned, they weren't going to even consider that peace deal anyway. But this was Russia, if nothing else, rhetorically offering some kind of final olive branch to end the war. At this point, that's over and done with. We don't know yet what Russia's response is going to be. If there is going to be, in the same way around Kharkov, a way of occupying and controlling territory to create this buffer. This may be something that that Putin is considering. Right now, we are still in the process of stabilizing the Kursk front and pushing Ukrainian forces back into Ukraine.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and I'm back here with Dr. Michael Rossy, who's a lecturer at Rutgers University in New Jersey, where he teaches political science and international relations, focusing on the connection between culture and politics. You might know Michael Rossy from his own YouTube channel, Michael Rossy Poli, on which he keeps publishing very valuable primary sources in the form of uncommented speeches and press releases from the Russian state, making those video documents available to many of us who don't speak the Russian language. He also has his own, he also gives his own commentary on his channel, and today he's here with us speaking from Tashkent to give us an update about what's going on in between Russia and Ukraine. Michael, very welcome.
Thank you for having me back, Pascal. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, Michael, we were exchanging some emails and we said we should talk about the situation because you're monitoring the Russian news media quite a bit. And at the moment, a lot is going on, right? We've had Ukraine's incursion into the Russian Kursk region where there still troops are remaining. We've had a New York Times article that came out about the conscripts that were taken prisoners from there, which I commented on yesterday, and I find that quite horrible that the New York Times did that. And we now have all the war that's still going on in Ukraine, and apparently New York was just the Russians just took that and other places. Could you give us a rundown of what happened in the last couple of days?
Well, you had summed it up, I think, quite succinctly here. But one thing that I need to make clear is that official Russian media immediately played this whole incursion as little more than a PR stunt. Really, they had no idea why Ukraine was doing this. It was seen as a waste of resources at best, a suicide run at absolute worst. Many of the commentaries had noted that Ukraine was sending in a number of its seasoned fighters, along with some of its more heavy weapons and equipment, with the intention, we understand, of reaching Kursk, and if not occupying the city, at least holding captive the nuclear power plant. with the idea of using it as a bargaining chip, some kind of leverage in any upcoming talks with Russia, which the Ukrainian government has said that it is time to now bring Russia into the discussion. But without any leverage of its own, they needed to make this gamble, which the official Russian media thought was, absolutely idiotic, because there was no way that they were going to reach Kursk, and that this would be a simple mopping up campaign that would take 2, 3 days, 4 days tops. We find, obviously, that a week, 2 weeks have passed. That has not happened. So the media has, had to, take a, somewhat of a criticism, coming also from many Russians themselves, who were thinking that the media coverage, I think, was too quick and dismissive. And I will also want to differentiate between official media sources and the various Telegram channels that I follow, which, as we just spoke about, the Telegram channels, you have to take with a little bit of a grain of salt, right? Because they are either very much pro-Russian, very much pro-Ukrainian, but many of the pro-Russian channels were very quick to criticize, even chastise, the official Russian media for being almost too hubristic in this, and saying that it would take anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks, maybe even up to a month, to stabilize the situation. We find, and again, I'm going from Telegram, that the situation has been stabilized within the Kursk region. The Ukrainian forces are still there, but they're not making any additional incursions, while Russian counter-terrorist forces, along with Ramzan Kadyrov's Akhmat's troops, are looking to effectively encircle them and capture the border between Russia and Ukraine to isolate all of them and get them either to surrender or go down in some kind of guts and glory fight. But there's no doubt, either from the official Russian channels as well as the Telegram channels, that this is Russia's advantage, that Ukraine made an unbelievably calculated mistake in this, and that the biggest loss is in life as well as valuable resources. Last I checked, Ukraine has lost more than 1,500 troops, along with a number of armored vehicles, tanks, weapons, among others. And again, I say that these are not just simply conscripts, that many of them are seasoned fighters, which deplete Ukraine's reinforcements on its own battlefields. And at the same time, the understanding was that Russia would pull its troops back from the Ukrainian side to reinforce and stabilize the Kursk side. That has not happened. We saw that there was some readjustment of forces, but Russia continues to make inroads in Ukraine, specifically around Donetsk and Lugansk. As we just mentioned, New York was captured earlier today, and the now key city of Pokrovsk is still, in a gray zone. But last I checked, Ukrainian military officials were ordering evacuation of civilians of the area to prepare for the imminent capture of the area by Russians. So I'm wondering, ultimately, what was the objective, the primary objective of Ukraine making this incursion? And if it was done specifically for public relations, to boost morale, or more likely to show the world, Russia first and foremost, that Ukraine can do this, and that Russia has weak and unmanned borders, then this was done as a way of humiliating Putin, as well as the Russian military high command. It's at this point, there is no chance of them even reaching Kursk, let alone reaching the nuclear power plant. But the fact that they can do this, cause mayhem, and still successfully be there after 2 weeks, still sort of doing hit and run tactics, shows that they can be a thorn in Russia's side. And if they do pull back out, another point that I was thinking of is that this could happen in other areas. They could do this in Belarus. They can do this in Kaliningrad if need be. They could make further inroads in various other locations. And if that's the case, then Ukraine is not as helpless or as fragmented as we would like to believe. But that is, in my opinion, very much a reduced estimate of what the ultimate and original objective was, which the momentum has now been, absolutely lost.
Yeah, some of the darker interpretations of what this phase of the war now means might be a shift from a symmetric kind of warfare to an asymmetric one in which Ukraine shifts more to guerrilla and pinprick tactics. And this might be the first of several ones. But again, the fact that Ukraine is running out of people, that is the biggest, I think, factor in the necessity for some change to come, right? The whole rest, I mean, even if there were more weapons from the West, and the West is promising more of them, and even if there's the promise you can use them inside Russia, the current situation, the political situation is such that the West says we will not send boots. This idea was floated around 2 months ago, especially by the French, but this one was effectively shut down. That's what we
Correct.
know, at least for now. The question then is now, what is Russia's strategy in order to drive the war toward an ending, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you, from what you see on Instagram, do you have any indications of where the thinking is going? Because winning a war or winning battles is one thing, but you might still end up winning every single battle, but losing the war by not achieving peace.
Right.
Do you see anything on the channels?
The Telegram channels still, and again, you have to take the Telegram channels for what they are. They have still maintained the strategy of just, maintain the current momentum, because you have that momentum. Eventually, this Kursk incursion will be taken care of. There are still gains that are made on the Ukrainian side. There has been no change whatsoever, let's say, on the Zaporozhye and Kherson front. That has been almost now just an absolute standstill. And there are still notable gains in Donetsk and Lugansk. Right? Donetsk is really the big one. But what that still leaves open is this idea that while Russia makes gains within the East, Ukraine is still able to attack and hit border cities like Belgorod, and may very well, as you say, and I absolutely agree with you, they may resort to more guerrilla tactics, right? They might resort to more, let's say, kamikaze strategies, which may very well even include attacking the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, making drone attacks against Kursk, and sort of eroding what they believe to be Russian morale among the civilian population along those border areas. Now, we have to remember, I mean, Russia is vastly huge, and this is little more than a pinprick within Russia. The response among Russian citizens has been to actively engage in humanitarian assistance, providing temporary location for those Russian civilians that have been displaced from the area, from Ukrainian forces. This may lead to some additional signups within the military. It very well could, and this has not been discussed within Putin's inner circle, for an increase in mobilization. Right now, Russia's strategy, at least on the outside, is to simply maintain status quo. And this is it's a hiccup, but this is what happens in warfare. I mean, this was almost to be expected. And so this is still within the framework of, of military stability as far as Russia is concerned. So, I think that we may be, if this is wrapped up within another week or so, we may see that this was nothing more than just, a bump. If Ukraine continues to send forces into the region, even if it's just to hold certain towns in the same way that Russia is holding, dozens and dozens within Ukraine, what this might do is show the West, specifically NATO, that Ukraine is not yet dead, like its anthem opens up with, right? Ukraine is not yet vanquished. Because Ukraine has, arguably speaking, a closing window of relevancy. The election in the United States is coming up, and it's amazing how much global politics revolves around elections in my country. With the understanding that if Trump wins, and I also have to say that since the internal changeover in the United States, with Biden being forced out and Kamala Harris being brought in, his chances have went from almost a surefire victory to, I'd say, 50-50 at this point. But he still has a good chance of winning. If that happens, right, the Ukraine stage, the Ukraine factor, ends up becoming pushed back to page 6 in the newspapers. Zelensky knows this. Syrskyi knows this. The Ukrainian government, they know this. So they want to make a show. They want to make a splash to make it look like that they are still relevant and can fight. And if Harris wins, and the Democratic Party is, going to continue Biden's policy of just, writing checks to Ukraine, then it shows that they still deserve to be funded from the West. And if the West says that Ukraine can do what it wants with the weapons that we give them, and we see no problem with them using them on Russian territory, which, I have to say is pretty much as close to an open proxy war as I've ever seen before, then this, if nothing else, gives Ukraine the opportunity of, as you also point out, prolonging any sense of a negotiated settlement, to which Putin responded to this incursion by saying the peace agreement that he had laid out for them about a month or two ago is now dead on arrival, right? So that's done. That's gone. Which, I mean, as far as the Ukrainian side is concerned, they weren't going to even consider that peace deal anyway. But this was Russia, if nothing else, rhetorically offering some kind of final olive branch to end the war. At this point, that's over and done with. We don't know yet what Russia's response is going to be. If there is going to be, in the same way around Kharkov, a way of occupying and controlling territory to create this buffer, this may be something that that Putin is considering. Right now, we are still in the process of stabilizing the Kursk front and pushing Ukrainian forces back into Ukraine.
So in a sense, this Kursk incursion also was the burning of the olive branch, or whatever it might have been, as in, no, Russia, no, we are going to fight this out. Do you interpret it in that way, or might it just, in the end, just be something stupid?
I mean, at some point, Putin may offer another peace agreement, but it's going to come with even more conditions than the previous one, which, unless there is just a complete collapse of support for Ukraine, where there's some internal revolution within Kiev, in which we see Zelensky, Syrskyi, and others, running for the Polish border, it's going to just simply be, nothing more than rhetorical. Because we have to think about this for a moment. Putin's peace terms effectively call for the reduction of territory in Ukraine. I mean, this is 19th century peace terms that the West is absolutely opposed to. If Putin, in the beginning of this conflict, had captured territory and occupied it just simply as a bargaining chip to get Zelensky to renege on any agreements with NATO, the EU, anything else. Ukraine declares neutrality. And at the end of this, the territory is returned to Ukraine. Ukraine is kept whole. Crimea is, something else. The West may have pressured him to say, you know what, fine, go and do this at some point. Crimea was always a sticking point because that meant that that Ukraine would give up any claims, any control of Crimea, which, we talked earlier about no state gives up territory voluntarily like that, right? And Serbia is still laying claim to Kosovo. Why should Ukraine, not lay claim, to Crimea? But now, with the addition of Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, there is absolutely no way that any government in Kiev would sign this unless they were facing, total defeats in war. So the West has just disregarded Putin as nothing more than some, military invader with delusions of grandeur. And so for them, this is not even on the table. Whatever peace agreement, whatever final proposal that the West comes up with, I'm fairly certain that there will be very little territorial change to Ukraine. And there's no support whatsoever, for Zaporozhye and Kherson to be included.
I mean, by sabotaging that peace agreement, which was basically almost done in April 2022, which would have kept Ukraine as close as it gets to an optimal condition, the West now basically made any such deal impossible. And Russia would, just frankly speaking, it would be a dumb thing to do to say, like, we give up unless they were again losing militarily on the battlefield. And it doesn't look like that. So the problem, it seems to me now, is that we're going to end up in a Korean situation in which you're going to have a border, a hard border, which at some point people will control. You might still have pinpricks on both sides, but no military way of getting everything. And then both sides will lay claim to this territory, and this will continue to poison Europe for for the foreseeable future, for our lifetimes maybe.
Yeah.
And it could be very well that we now see this other dream of the neocons coming true of Afghanizing Ukraine and making sure Russia has to continue bleed for 20 years or so in exchange for occupying those territories. Hillary Clinton spoke about this very openly. This would be a very natural thing to do, especially if these people think about how the Soviet Union last time was driven out of Afghanistan. First and foremost, how they were driven out of Afghanistan, right? That you continue this boiling, and you can keep this boiling on a very cheap and very low level, and it will continue to inflict hurt.
Well, I know that the West likes to still think that Russia is the Soviet Union. And this is, I just think, a gross misinterpretation and a very careless miscalculation as well. We've also spoken last time around about, Glenn Deason and his work on Russophobia, which is a book that I still recommend, all of your readers to check out, because it really lays bare the attitudes and the perceptions that the West has about Russia. So, to this point here, I have to give some bit of warning here. Russia today is not the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. The Red Army was heavily demoralized in occupying Afghanistan, which Afghanistan is very good at doing to any outside force. It will eventually demoralize any soldier, any army whatsoever. Afghanistan was foreign territory to the Soviet Union. Ukraine has some cultural, historical, moral, emotional value to Russia. And this isn't justifying any, greater Russian claims of territory or anything else like that, right? But it's a fraternal war between two countries in which those that are doing the fight on both sides, right? I mean, this is sort of a matter of pride, of honor in that regard. So Russia is, not going to be bled dry as much as the West would like to believe, especially when Russian economy is now growing, expanding. It has transitioned successfully to a wartime economy. Its military combatants are still largely either private organizations, volunteer sign-ups. There is not a general mobilization that you would find in Ukraine. That's why morale in Ukraine is so low, because you see so many of these soldiers that a week ago were walking the street at the wrong place at the wrong time, were basically picked up by the military recruiters, thrown into a van, and shipped off to the front. They have no stake in fighting. The morale is comparatively far lower than that is within Russia. So with that, morale is high, territory is still being gained. Russia's economy is almost operating, certainly separate from all of this. They can afford. They can actually afford the scenario that you envisioned, which is a frozen conflict, a hard border. If there is any kind of negotiated ceasefire without any resolution after this, Russia can hold the front. Putin doesn't want that, though, because for him, that gives Ukraine time to recoup, reload, and reorganize. But if it gets to that point, one thing I can see within Russia is that, let's just say that for whatever happens, Putin gets what he wants. He gets the four regions along with Crimea. What that does is it allows Ukraine to retain Kharkov and Odessa, which is vital for Ukraine's existence, especially Odessa, right? That gives that Black Sea access. But there will be hardliners in Russia, there will be the war hawks that may criticize Putin for stopping before he should have delivered the final blow. Now, can Russia do that is another story, because their expansion, their territorial gains on the front is incredibly slow, which is something that we're not exactly sure, either is Russia just not that militarily capable of advancing. We like to think about blitzkrieg. We think about American forces where my country can take a country in less than a week, right? Russia has been doing this now for over 2 years. Or is Russia going slow and steady by going through another strategy, the grind? Just simply grinding Ukraine's forces down to the point where they just get so tired that they'll just give up and be willing to agree to anything. That is something that is, under lock and key within the Russian military Ministry of Defense.
Well, one of the things that we know about this, what Russia told us even at the beginning of the war, is like one of the aims of the special military operation is the demilitarization of Ukraine. And there's two ways of achieving that. One is by agreement, the other one is by force. And one of the things that a couple of other commentators keep pointing out is that it seems that Russia was from the beginning, at least after April, or like when everything was reconstituted toward a long war, was about getting rid of Ukraine's capacity to threaten Russia. And that's the problem is, it's not just Ukraine's capacity, it's NATO capacity, right?
Yes.
And NATO has been shoveling in incredible loads of weapons. I mean, Leopard Panthers and whatnot, and all of these missiles, and Russia is shooting them down. So there might even be an incentive to do the inverse, to Afghanize Ukraine, but to the NATO side. And the more weapons NATO sends in, the more the Russians will shoot that down and demilitarize militarily, not just Ukraine, but actually NATO. So that's just this conflict logic is now going into a way in which a prolonged, protracted conflict might actually come with strategic benefits on both sides, or that both sides might perceive as beneficial. Do you see any of that going on?
Yeah, let's be perfectly honest here. I mean, Ukraine's survival at this point is almost exclusively done because of NATO, and more so the United States. That's not to say that Ukraine would completely collapse, but I mean, they would certainly be forced, as you pointed out, within the first month of the war, Ukraine was ready to sign a deal, the Istanbul Accords. And then Boris Johnson steps in and says, effectively, no, don't do that just yet. Many of us in the West are waiting for our, military stock to, go up. We're making money off of this. And some have even gone so far as to say that it's a good investment. I mean, some of my less reputable politicians have gone so far as to say it's a fantastic way of, we don't lose any of our soldiers. Our money goes in to have other people fight and kill Russians, and we can continue to do this ad infinitum. The United States, there's a reason why we don't have healthcare in my country, because we have all of this investment within the military industrial complex. So if it benefits the US, the UK, Germany, Poland, NATO, as a whole, to continue pumping Ukraine with weapons that, gives it the ability to survive another 2 weeks, then that's exactly what's going to happen. Will Russia be able to shoot the missiles down, capture the tanks, shoot that? Probably. But what this leads us to consider is the only way to wear Russia down from the West is through a long, protracted war of attrition. Whether it's economics, which is what happened in the 1980s, which led to the internal collapse of the Soviet Union, was that, Reagan's whole approach is that I can bankrupt the Soviet Union, right? The capitalism can borrow money like it's no tomorrow, and communism cannot. So we're going to outspend Russia in military spending. Gorbachev has to respond in kind, and the entire system collapses. If this is the same strategy, which, again, many of the U.S. leaders still like to think that it's still the old Soviet Union, and B, the United States is still existing in 1993, then it remains to be seen if this will work out. But it won't, the results won't happen. We won't see anything for at least another 2 years, 3 years. And in that time, Ukraine just continues to just be turned into a crater. Tens of thousands will, either flee the country or get destroyed in the war. I mean, to the West, Ukraine is the Pyrrhic, victory to solidify NATO and to, I don't know, cripple Russia. But I mean, it's a horrible victory, one without any real morals, in my opinion. But
no, the horrible thing is that the people in the West who shout the most that they want to save Ukraine, they are willing to sacrifice as many Ukrainians as it takes.
Yes.
I mean, the same people who tell us that we must do everything to help Ukraine are the same people who tell us that we must now think about sending Ukrainian men back to go and serve their country. And it's mind-boggling, and it's sickening to which extent these people are willing to drag out this war. But it leaves us with the question, and I discussed that with Glenn Deason 2 weeks ago. What is the counter strategy, especially if we suppose that this hurts the Russians more, and that the Russians would be the ones who want to drive the war down and get to this situation that the United States got with Japan. I mean, that was fantastic, right? How the US won a victory and Japan surrendered, and a few years later was the best ally of the United States ever, and remained so for 70 years. That should be the goal, right, for the Russians with Ukraine. But it's very hard to see how to pull that one off, as long as these weapons and unconditional support keeps flowing in. So probably it is outside of the political abilities of the political process inside Ukraine to do so, and it will depend upon whether weapons flow or not. If you get to a condition in which even the ultra right-wing nationalists would be willing to cut a deal with Putin in order to preserve statehood.
Well, within this context, I was remembering there was an article written in the early 90s by James Fearon, and I don't remember the title particularly offhand, but he focuses on what's called commitment problems or commitment issues within foreign policy. And the gist of it is that countries like the United States, or even more so, liberalist states, states that operate within the liberalist principle of ideology, we are out to save the world from the tyrannies of evil. It's very difficult for them to suddenly reverse gears and it go from we will defend Ukraine's right to enter NATO. Ukraine is fighting against Russian expansionism, to all of a sudden then cutting a deal, right? It just doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. Even though it might be militarily strategic, it might be economically beneficial, you just don't do that. When you sign up for an objective, you'll burn the country to the ground in order to achieve that objective. And so while there are those in Russia and those that are more on the pro-Russian side that think all that it takes is a grinding down of resolve in Ukraine, or a changeover in leadership, or some one momentous event that gets the West to change their strategy. It would have to be an unbelievably major event, like the use of nuclear weapons or something like that, right? Or a Trump victory coupled with the collapse of centrist governments across Europe. Macron is out, Mélenchon comes in, AfD comes in. Starmer's government just completely collapses in the UK, and all you have left are Poland and the 3 Baltic states that are willing to fight, and no one else is willing to do so. In order for that to happen, I mean, there just has to be just major, just a systemic revolution within Europe and within NATO. And if that doesn't happen, they're going to continue to pursue this, especially if the war is outsourced. If they don't lose any of their own specific material, I mean, Ukraine is expendable. And if it ultimately means that Russia will tire out before the West does, then mission accomplished. I think also, I think I want to add this because you mentioned Japan. I was thinking about even Vietnam. For that matter as well, right? Vietnam America could have continued Vietnam for as long as possible. But finally it was Nixon that said, okay, this we can't win. And it's very difficult for the United States to admit defeat. Afghanistan did. And it's, what we the narrative for us was, well, we achieved our original objectives anyway 20 years ago by getting al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan, which is, again, it's like, listen, if you're going to gaslight, you need to be a little bit more effective in this. But isn't it interesting that nobody talks about Afghanistan anymore? And we quickly shifted gears towards Ukraine. Afghanistan wasn't worth it, but this one is going to be worth it, right? Or something like there's a major war that happens between Iran and Israel, which forces us to shift gears away from Ukraine and focus on that. But other than that, commitment issues, commitment problems are things that lock a country's foreign policy into something. You say you're going to do this, and they're backing out ruins your reputation.
Yeah. But it's another thing. It's commitment, absolutely right. But the second thing is what you just mentioned, and that's attention. As long as attention can be focused on a point, the incentive, the reputation incentive to not let go of the failed policy is super high. But the way that we have seen in which the Ukraine war basically became the next Afghanistan and completely crowded out Afghanistan, even though Afghanistan was at that point in a super dire situation, which it still is, and then put immediately on the sanctions and so on, but crowded out. It also crowded out COVID that ended, right? In 2020, 2021, there was just no ability to focus on a war because we were busy with another one, the one against COVID. And yeah. So in the same sense, there's now this factor in the Middle East that we're still waiting for the response of Iran. And there are reports that Russia is actually helping Iran now with missile defense system and whatnot, and that Iran is actually now building up the actual capacity of fighting a war with Israel and by extension with the United States, although that one will look very different. Because if one thing is clear, it is that the US will not be willing to sacrifice Israel the way that it was willing to expend the entirety of Ukraine. I mean,
Yes.
Israel has a completely different, is a completely different animal, right?
Yes.
Yes. That's what we've learned now. It's rather Israel that has the that has power over the US political process and not the inverse, which will mean that the war fighting will happen in a completely different way. But in your sources, what you're reading from Russian media, traditional media, and Telegram channels, what about the factor in the Middle East? What do the Russians think about that one?
Russia has played a very legalistic, neutral role. First, they openly support the existence, the creation of a Palestinian state, right, with East Jerusalem as its capital. Now, that's easy enough to say, but creating such a state involves going to war with Israel. I mean, there's no other way around this, right? Israel is not going to allow this to happen, especially when they're going to say, well, if this happens, what about all of our settlers? To which, the rest of the world will say, to hell with your settlers, okay, go out. That's not going to happen because the United States is going to prevent that, right? I mean, Israel, it's hard to say who controls who in all of this. I think it's symbiotic, where Israel knows that it has a green light from anyone who's going to win in November. If it's Trump, Netanyahu can final solution on the Palestinians. If it's Harris, it's just going to have to be pulling your punches. But there will be no real pressure on Israel. There might be some rhetorical things, but other than that, it's Netanyahu, the Israeli government, the Israeli political elite know that they are protected by the United States. And as you also point out, if there is a war that breaks out, the United States will get itself involved. They might not put boots on the ground, but they will defend Israel to the end. There are two countries that the United States will absolutely positively give carte blanche support to in the world, the UK and Israel. There's no question. Every other country, there's an expiration date on that. Right? There's an expiration date. Some a little bit more than others. Russia's whole response to all of this is first creation of a Palestinian state, but a two-state solution in which Palestinians live alongside that of Israel. So Russia is, certainly not with Iran calling for the end of the Israeli state. Russia has good relations with the Israeli government. We have to remember that there are a lot of Russians that live in Israel. So they're taking much more of a structural approach to the Middle East. However, their support for Iran also comes more so with economic and infrastructural reasons. Iran is now a member of BRICS, along with Saudi Arabia. We tend to forget this, right? We tend to think, right, that the Gulf states, the Arab states are going to side with Israel and the United States. Not as much as they used to. I don't know. We haven't seen this play out, but BRICS has expanded. And Iran is a major ally of this. And this may also lead to, God, I hope it doesn't happen like this, but I'm thinking more and more about how alliance networks are sort of building up to what it was around 1914.
Yeah.
Where all it takes is some stupid Austrian visiting some godforsaken Balkan city on the wrong holiday, and bang, bang, off we go, and alliances go here, here, here. Will this drag Russia into a conflict in the Middle East? Will this drag China? Will this drag? We haven't even talked about China. What the United States might do in waging, open economic wars, or whether Taiwan comes into the equation. If it blows up in the Middle East like that, or China, I mean, Ukraine becomes, no longer the trending hashtag, which they know. I think this is why Zelensky was also trying to do something in Kursk, is to make Ukraine back on the front page, give some people this idea that Ukraine still has some kind of tactical event, and if nothing else, just to give Russia a bloody nose, to go down fighting. As you said, with more guerrillas-like tactics, kamikaze, type warfare that inflicts a number of some serious damage on Russia. So we're sort of jumping around here. I know we were talking about the Middle East. I was bringing in China. All of this.
They belong together. This belongs together. I mean, as sad as it is, but we are getting closer and closer to a world war. Not one that explodes one at a time, but little by little, which is actually the Second World War. Didn't become a world war in 39 to 41. It was a European war. And then it expanded because of what Japan did on the other side. So my question then is whether there is a strategic interest in Russia to maybe say that, you know what, Iran fighting would actually be not too bad for us. Let's pay the Americans back the way they try to pay us. Have you ever heard anything of that? I hope not.
No. If it has, it's not the Telegram channels that I've been following, and I don't read the comments. I just read the articles. Sometimes I just check the comments to see the comment sections are usually from the most hawkish type of people, but these are comments from ordinary Telegram users. That's it. So no, we haven't gotten to that point yet, and I hope that we never do.
No, because the last thing we want is this spreading. But the problem is that the logic of warfare, and especially when war becomes systemic, the way that we are nearing now in Ukraine, again, if the grinding down of the other one becomes something that both of them want, then you keep it alive for mutually beneficial purposes, which is a sick thing to happen, but it can happen.
But what is even more problematic about this is that the momentum to keep this going is rooted within American liberal foreign policy. This idea that the ideology of America, and I'm saying this just because the United States is the most influential out of all of this, right? If France or the UK had the capability, they would do so as well. But there is this messianic crusading zeal to, if not democratize and civilize parts of the developing world, prevent the hegemonic rivals from gaining a foothold. And right now, it's Russia that is seen as the most vocal ideological rival, but China is the bigger economic one. Right? China's foreign policy is still very quiet. Russia is kind of like, the loud one in the room, and China is the sleeping dragon. But both of these countries have become closer and closer and closer together, in which any efforts by the United States to wean one away from the other, I think, have failed. I mean, there's just no way around that. And you're absolutely right in that we may very well see a series of conflicts that take place, in which the United States and NATO, the UK, are all part of it, because of their desire to maintain some kind of ideological momentum, or if nothing else, if we pull back from Ukraine, Russia wins. If we pull back from Taiwan, China wins. If we pull back from Israel, Iran wins. And we can't let that happen.
Goddamn zero-sum thinking without any kind of shared interest and shared prosperity. But this is what's ruining us right now. I wish we could end on a happier note, but the world is what it is. Michael Rossy Poli. Follow him on YouTube. Follow him on Twitter. You're on Twitter. Yes, you are on Twitter.
I am. I do have a Twitter account. Yes.
I see. It pops up sometimes. Follow him there.
Yes, it does.
And any other place to follow you?
Well, Instagram, but that's just solely photography. It's my happy place. There's no politics. There's no politics there.
Everybody keep a happy place. Michael Rossy, thank you very much.
Thank you, Pascal.